The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made the air itself feel heavy. Streetlights flickered along a cracked sidewalk, casting long shadows that stretched like ghosts. And in the middle of it all walked Keisha, young black girl in her early 20s. Her coat too thin for the weather, her shoes scuffed from years of wear. She clutched her purse tight, not because it held much, but because it held everything. Inside that purse lay a single crumpled bill, $8. Her last $8. She had planned to use it for dinner, something small for herself and her little brother waiting at home. Maybe a box of noodles, maybe bread and peanut butter. Nothing special, but enough to quiet his stomach, enough to let him sleep. As Keisha turned the corner, the distant roar of an engine sputtered, then coughed into silence. Ahead, under the dim glow of a failing streetlight, a motorcycle sat crooked on the side of the road. A man knelt beside it, his hands greasy, his expression frustrated. He was hard to miss: broad shoulders, tattoos winding down his arms, a leather jacket patched with insignias that told everyone exactly who he was. A Hell's Angel, the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid. Keisha slowed. Instinct told her to keep walking. Trouble clung to men like him, but then she noticed the way his hand trembled as he patted his pockets, the way his eyes darted around, not angry, but tired. Defeated, damn it, the biker muttered under his breath. He kicked at the bike and sat back on the curb, shaking his head. Keisha swallowed hard. She could almost hear her stomach growl, could almost see her little brother waiting at the kitchen table, asking if she'd brought food. She knew what that $8 meant. It meant survival, just for one more night. But she also knew what it felt like to be stranded, to feel invisible, to have no one in the world willing to stop for you. Her feet hesitated, caught between selfish need and selfless instinct. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "Are you okay?" The biker looked up, startled. His eyes, sharp and gray, under the flickering light, softened just a little when he saw her. "Bike's out of gas. Station's a mile away. Guess I'll be walking." Keisha shifted, her hand tightening around her purse strap. The choice weighed on her like a stone. Her brother's hungry face, her empty wallet, her aching feet, and then her decision. She pulled out the wrinkled bill, staring at it for a long moment before extending her hand. "Here, take this. It's all I got. Should be enough to get you a little gas." The biker blinked, stunned. For a second, he didn't move. He just stared at her, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick. Finally, slowly, he reached out and accepted the money. His rough fingers brushed hers, and his voice came low, almost unsure. "Why? You don't even know me." Keisha gave a small, tired smile. "Because I know what it feels like to need help. That's all." The biker's gaze lingered on her, searching, measuring. He gave the faintest nod, his lips pressing into a thin line as though words failed him. "I'll pay you back. Someday, you have my word." Keisha shook her head. "Don't worry about it." And with that, she turned, walking down the cracked sidewalk toward home. Each step felt heavier than the last. The cold wind bit at her cheeks, but inside, a strange warmth flickered behind her. The biker stood in silence, the crumpled bill still in his hand. He wasn't used to kindness, not from strangers, not from someone who clearly had so little to give. He slipped the money into his pocket and watched until she disappeared around the corner. That $8 bill didn't just buy him gas. It bought something else entirely, something that would ripple far beyond that freezing night, because Keisha didn't know it yet, but that single act of compassion had already set a chain of events in motion, events that would change her life forever. And the very next night, the rumble of vengeance would return. Some moments in life etched themselves so deeply into memory, they never leave. For the biker on that lonely street, this was one of them. He stood there, clutching the wrinkled bill in his hand, staring at the place where Keisha had disappeared. The cold wind whipped across his face, tugging at his leather jacket, but he barely felt it. All he could feel was the weight of what had just happened. To anyone else, it might have been pocket change, but from her, it was everything. His name was Ryder. His life had been built on strength, loyalty, and reputation. He had the look of a man who'd seen too many fights and lost too many friends. A jagged scar ran across his cheek like a permanent reminder of battles past. And yet, despite his rough edges, in that moment, he looked shaken. He glanced down at the money, then back toward the empty street, his voice breaking the silence. "She gave me her last." There was no one to hear him, no one to answer, but the words hung heavy in the air. Ryder had been shown kindness before, sure. In his world, brothers took care of each other. But a stranger, a broke young woman who had every reason to walk away, that was something he couldn't wrap his head around. He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, staring at the faint glow of the lighter against the night. His eyes softened, a rare vulnerability surfacing. For the first time in years, Ryder felt something stir in him. Not pity, not guilt, but respect. He muttered to himself again. "That girl, she's got more guts than half the men I know." Moments later, a tow truck rolled by. The driver leaned out, offering a ride to the nearest gas station. Ryder hesitated before climbing in, still clutching the crumpled bill tightly, as though afraid it might vanish. Inside the truck, silence filled the space until the driver finally asked, "Friend of yours?" Ryder shook his head slowly, his eyes narrowing. Not yet. The truck jolted forward, headlights cutting through the darkness. Ryder stared out the window, his reflection staring back at him, rugged outlaw with tired eyes. But behind that reflection, another face lingered. Keisha's, the way she had looked at him. Not with fear, not with judgment, but with something else. Humanity. It had been years since anyone had looked at him like that. Back at the station, Ryder filled a gas can and paid with the money she had given him. He expected it to sting, to feel wrong spending her last dollars. But as the pump clicked off, he realized something. This wasn't just about gas. This was about a promise. Her words replayed in his mind, soft but steady. Because I know what it feels like to need help. Ryder clenched his jaw. That wasn't something he could forget. Not tonight, not ever. When he finally returned to his bike and poured the gas into the tank, he didn't immediately ride off. Instead, he sat there, astride the machine, staring at the dark horizon. His scarred fingers tapped against the handlebars, restless. He thought about his brothers, the ones who prided themselves on never owing anyone, on always paying back their debts. Well, he owed now. And not just money. He owed something bigger. With the rumble of the engine beneath him, Ryder finally rode into the night. But his mind wasn't on the road. It was on a girl with tired eyes and a brave heart, who had given when she had nothing left to give. As the city lights blurred around him, Ryder made a silent vow. He wasn't going to let this act of kindness fade into memory. This was just the beginning, and soon, his brothers would hear about it. The city was quiet that night, too quiet for comfort, the kind of silence that pressed against Keisha's ears as she made her way down the cracked sidewalk. The faint hum of distant traffic couldn't mask the echo of her footsteps. She pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, her breath fogging in the air. Her stomach growled, sharp and relentless, but she ignored it. She had grown used to the ache. Hunger had become part of her life, a constant companion, just like the worries that filled her head. The streetlights flickered above her, their pale glow stretching across buildings with boarded-up windows and graffiti-tagged walls. This wasn't a place where kindness usually bloomed, and yet, she had just given away her last $8. Every step toward home, she reminded herself why. It was the right thing to do. Still, she couldn't stop imagining the look on her little brother's face when he asked, "What's for dinner?" Her apartment building stood at the corner of the block, tired and crumbling, the paint peeling from its walls. Inside, the stairwell smelled of mildew and smoke, the buzzing light overhead threatening to go out completely. She climbed the steps slowly, the exhaustion in her legs heavier than her footsteps. When she reached the door, she paused. She couldn't walk in looking defeated. She couldn't let him see the truth. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. "Keisha," a small voice called from the couch. Her little brother, Jamal, sat cross-legged with a comic book in his lap. His eyes lit up when he saw her. She forced a smile. "Hey champ, you still awake?" "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, shrugging. Then his gaze flicked to her hands. "Did you bring something to eat?" The words cut deep. Keisha swallowed hard, placing her purse down carefully, as though it might shatter. She crouched in front of him, brushing his curls back from his forehead. "Not tonight," she whispered softly. "But tomorrow's gonna be better." Jamal's shoulders slumped for a second, but he didn't complain. He never did. Instead, he leaned into her and rested his head on her shoulder. For a moment, the silence between them said everything. She led him to bed, tucking him under the thin blanket. "Close your eyes," she said gently. "Dream about something good. Dream about Mom smiling down on us." Jamal nodded, his eyelids heavy, and within minutes, his breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. Keisha sat by his bedside a while longer, her own hunger forgotten, watching the rise and fall of his chest. This was why she kept going. This was why she worked long shifts at dead-end jobs, why she endured the weight of bills piling on the counter. Not for herself. For him. When she finally rose and stepped into the kitchen, the truth hit her harder than the hunger pang. The cupboards were nearly empty. A half loaf of stale bread, a can of beans she had been saving. She ran her hands over the chipped countertop, closing her eyes against the sting of tears. Her thoughts wandered back to the street, to the biker's surprised expression when she handed him the money. She couldn't explain why she'd done it, only that it had felt necessary, like a choice her heart made before her mind could argue. And maybe, just maybe, kindness would find its way back someday. She sat at the kitchen table, her head resting on folded arms, exhaustion pressing her down. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Her mind drifted between worry and hope, the lines blurring as her eyelids grew heavy. But outside, the city never really slept. Somewhere, engines roared through the night. Somewhere, that biker still held the memory of her sacrifice. And soon, that memory would come back to her doorstep louder, stronger, and more powerful than she could ever imagine. The night was late, and the air was thick with smoke and gasoline. Inside a dimly lit clubhouse on the edge of the city, the roar of engines faded as the last of the Hells Angels rolled in. Rows of bikes lined up like soldiers outside, chrome glinting under the yellow street lamps. Inside, the atmosphere was rough, heavy with the smell of leather, beer, and old wood. A jukebox hummed in the corner, drowning under the laughter and voices of hardened men who had seen too much of life to be surprised by much anymore. But tonight, something did surprise them. Ryder walked through the door, his leather jacket dusted with road grime, the scar on his cheek catching the light. He didn't look like a man coming back from a fight, or a job, or even a long ride. He looked thoughtful, and that was enough to quiet the room. "Ryder," one of the older bikers called out, raising his glass. "Where the hell you been? Thought you ran out of gas." The words hit harder than the man intended. Ryder stopped in the doorway, holding their gazes for a long moment before answering. His voice was low, steady, but tinged with something different. "Yeah, ran out of gas, but I didn't run out of luck." The men chuckled at first, but when Ryder dropped into a chair at the center table, they noticed the change in his eyes. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. "What happened?" another asked, leaning forward. Ryder reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled dollar bill. He set it on the table like it was worth more than gold. The bikers glanced at it, confused. "This," Ryder said, his voice sharp, "is the last $8 some girl had to her name. And she gave it to me. No questions, no fear. She didn't know me, didn't care who I was. She just gave." The room grew still. Smoke hung heavy in the silence. A younger member scoffed. "Some girl. People don't just hand out their last dollar." "Ryder, you sure about this?" Ryder's jaw tightened. "I looked her in the eye. She wasn't lying. I could see it. She didn't have nothing, but she gave anyway." For a long beat, no one spoke. The men who prided themselves on toughness, on loyalty, on living by their own rules, suddenly found themselves confronted by a story that sounded almost unreal. An older biker, gray in his beard and wisdom in his eyes, finally leaned back and muttered, "That's the kind of thing we talk about. Loyalty, sacrifice, brotherhood. And she's out there living it better than half the men I know." The words hung in the air. Heads nodded slowly. The roughest of men who lived by codes written in grease and blood, understood what Ryder was saying. Ryder clenched his fist around the crumpled bill, his voice hardening. "I owe her. We owe her. A debt like that too. Don't let it slide. Not in this life." One by one, the murmurs rose, voices whispering words like respect, honor, or debt. The tone shifted from disbelief to agreement, from silence to conviction. And then the president of the chapter, a giant of a man with a voice like gravel, stood from his chair. His presence alone silenced the room. "If what you're saying is true," he rumbled, "then this girl, she's family now, and family doesn't get left behind." The room erupted not in chaos, but in a kind of solemn agreement. Men who had never met Keisha, who didn't even know her name, felt bound to her by the story Ryder had told. The jukebox kept playing in the corner, but no one was listening anymore. The decision had been made. Something had been set in motion that night, something bigger than gas money, bigger than chance. A broke girl's kindness had reached into the heart of a world built on steel and scars. And those men, those 100 bikers, weren't about to forget it. And as Ryder leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile tugged at the scar on his cheek, because he knew before long she was going to hear the rumble of their engines again. The morning began quietly, almost deceptively so. Sunlight cut through the thin curtains of Keisha's small apartment, casting warm stripes across the worn floorboards. She moved slowly, every step heavy from the exhaustion of the night before. Her body was tired, but her mind wouldn't rest. She kept replaying what had happened at the diner, the decision to hand over her last $8. The way the biker had looked at her, almost bewildered, when she did it. It had been an act of instinct, not logic. She hadn't thought about rent, or food, or bills. She had simply seen someone in need and stepped forward. But now, as she poured a weak cup of instant coffee into a chipped mug, a thought nagged at her. What if that was the end of it? What if kindness doesn't come back around? Then she heard it, a sound that did not belong in her quiet neighborhood. The low growl of motorcycle engines, one at first, then two, then five, then what felt like dozens. The sound rolled through the streets like a storm, rattling window panes echoing off brick walls. Children peered out from cracked doorways. Neighbors pressed their faces to glass. Keisha froze, the mug trembling slightly in her hand. The rumble was getting closer. Within moments, the entire block seemed to vibrate under the weight of the engines. She stepped to her window and gently pulled the curtain aside. Her heart jumped down the narrow street. A line of motorcycles gleamed under the morning sun, chrome flashing, leather jackets glinting with patches she instantly recognized. The Hells Angels. At least 50 of them, maybe more. They weren't just passing through. They were parking engines cut one by one. But the silence that followed was no less intimidating. It was heavier, charged, the kind that made people hold their breath. Keisha's pulse quickened. She didn't move. She didn't blink. Then 3 sharp knocks echoed through her door. She nearly dropped her cup. Neighbors across the hall had opened their doors just a crack. An old man on the stoop downstairs leaned forward, gripping his cane. The entire block seemed to pause, as though waiting for what she would do next. Keisha stared at the door, paralyzed. Every instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to hide, to pretend she wasn't home. But something inside urged her to move. She set the cup down, walked to the door, and placed a trembling hand on the knob. She cracked it open, just enough to see Dot, and there they were. A wall of leather and denim, broad shoulders, weathered faces, sunglasses hiding unreadable eyes. The patches on their vests spoke louder than any words could, but the front stood. The man she recognized from last night, the same biker she had helped. His face was serious, but not hostile. His jaw was set, his posture rigid, as if he were holding back an entire sea of emotion. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched so long that Keisha thought she might faint. Then the biker stepped forward. "Morning," he said, his voice low, gravelly. "You remember me?" Keisha nodded, unable to form words. He glanced over his shoulder. The rest of the gang shifted, boots scraping on pavement. The sight of them made her want to shrink back inside and lock the door. But she stayed. Something in his eyes told her she wasn't in danger. "You gave me your last $8, he continued. "Didn't have to." Most people would have walked away. Keisha swallowed hard. It wasn't a big deal. But he shook his head. To me, it was everything." The words hung in the air, heavy, raw. Dot behind him. One of the bikers muttered, "She's the one." Another elbowed him into silence. Keisha's neighbors had now fully stepped outside, whispering among themselves. Mothers pulled their children closer, unsure if they should retreat. The entire block had turned into an audience, watching this strange and fragile moment unfold. Keisha gripped the doorframe. Why are you here?" The biker took a slow breath. "Because honor matters. Because debts get paid. And because you don't leave kindness unanswered." He glanced back at his brothers, then returned his gaze to her. "So here we are." Her heart thudded in her chest. The scene felt unreal, almost like a dream she couldn't wake from. 50 bikers outside her building, staring up at her, waiting for something. But what? The biker shifted his stance. "You think you're alone, Keisha?" You're not. Hearing her name from his lips sent a shiver down her spine. She hadn't told him. Somehow, he knew. Her neighbors gasped softly, murmuring. Some stepped farther back, worried the situation might explode into something they didn't understand. But Keisha couldn't move. She couldn't run. She couldn't hide. She stood at her doorway, frozen between fear and awe. The biker leaned forward slightly. His voice softened, almost gentle. "Mind if we come in?" And just like that, her breath caught, because behind those words lay something bigger than she could imagine. Something was about to happen. Something that would shift her world in ways she could not yet see. The rumble of engines had faded, but the weight of their presence lingered. The block was silent, waiting. Keisha tightened her grip on the knob. Her instincts told her this was the moment, one that would decide everything that came after. She looked at the biker, at the sea of leather behind him, and then back to her quiet, fragile apartment. Her lips parted, but the words didn't come. The chapter closes on that suspended breath, leaving us on the edge of her decision. What waits on the other side of that threshold will change not just her life, but the lives of everyone watching. The silence after his words lingered like smoke. Keisha stood in her doorway, uncertain if she had the strength to answer. 50 bikers outside her building, all staring at her, waiting not for violence, but for permission. At last, she nodded and stepped back. The lead biker, the one she had given her last $8 to, gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Then he motioned with his hand. Slowly, carefully, the others began to move. One by one, they didn't march inside with arrogance or noise. Instead, they carried boxes, cardboard crates stacked high, bags heavy with food, tools, even folded blankets. Keisha blinked. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. But no, it was real. The first biker set down a box on her small kitchen counter. She glanced inside and nearly staggered. Fresh fruit, vegetables, canned goods, bread, more food than she'd had in her apartment in months. Another laid down a bag filled with toiletries and cleaning supplies. Then came diapers, though she didn't even have a baby. Then came meat packed on ice, fresh milk, even cartons of eggs. Keisha's hand went to her mouth. What is all this? The biker she recognized, grizzled, weathered, but calm in her eyes. "It's what family does," he said. Her throat tightened. "But I'm not family." A younger biker chuckled from the doorway. "You are now." The room filled with quiet laughter, not mocking, but warm. For the first time, the tension began to ease. Keisha felt her shoulders drop, though her heart still pounded. She moved closer to one of the boxers, fingertips brushing over the labels. The colors, the impossible abundance. For someone who had been counting coins to buy ramen noodles just 2 days ago, this sight was almost too much to process. Then came the sound of hammers. Geo, she spun around to see 2 bikers examining her cracked doorframe, pulling out tool belts as if it were second nature. Another inspected the broken stove that hadn't worked for weeks. Someone else tapped at the flickering light above her sink. Keisha's eyes widened. "Wait, you don't have to." The biker leader raised his hand gently, stopping her. "Don't tell us what we don't have to do," he said. "You gave what you didn't have. Now we give what we do." Her knees felt weak. She leaned against the counter, overwhelmed. Neighbors had gathered in the hallway, whispering in disbelief. Mothers who once pulled their children away were now stepping forward, peeking in at the scene that seemed impossible. Tough bikers, feared on the streets, were fixing broken cabinets, carrying groceries, sweeping floors. It was a sight no one would believe unless they had seen it. Why? She finally whispered, "Why me?" The leader looked at her, eyes soft behind the steel. "Because you showed us something the world forgets," he said. "Honor doesn't come from patches. Loyalty doesn't come from fear. It comes from sacrifice. And you, little sister, reminded us of that." Her breath caught. Little sister. The words wrapped around her like a blanket. Another biker placed an envelope on her small table. She frowned, stepping closer. Her hand trembled as she opened it. Cash. Stacks of it. Her chest tightened. "No, I can take this." The leader's voice was firm, steady. "Yes, you can. Because it's not charity. It's respect." Tears burned in her eyes. She tried to blink them back, but they spilled anyway. She had spent so long fighting alone, so long believing that no one cared whether she sank or survived. And now, in the space of an hour, her tiny apartment overflowed with food, supplies, laughter, and strength. She pressed her hands to her face. "I don't deserve this." A tall biker with a scar down his cheek crouched to fix the baseboard heater. Without looking up, he said quietly, "That's the thing about family. You don't gotta earn it. You just got it." The words broke her. A sob escaped her lips, raw and unrestrained. She tried to cover her face, but the leader stepped closer, resting a calloused hand gently on her shoulder. "Cry, if you need to," he said softly, "but don't doubt this. You're one of us now." And this, he gestured to the bustling scene. The groceries, the repairs, the men working like they had known her their whole lives. This is only the beginning. Only the beginning. Keisha lowered her hands, tears streaking down her cheeks. For the first time in years, she felt something bloom in her chest that she had almost forgotten. Hope. The rumble of engines still echoed faintly outside, where more bikers waited with more supplies. She realized this wasn't just a visit. This wasn't just a single act of kindness repaid. Something larger was unfolding, something that could not be undone. The neighbors outside whispered louder, some stepping forward to help carry boxers, others simply watching in awe. Children tugged at their mothers' hands, pointing at the bikers with wide eyes. Keisha caught sight of an elderly woman at the edge of the crowd, smiling softly, as though she understood, as though she had seen, long ago, that sometimes the most unlikely people carry the greatest hearts. Inside, the repairs continued. The food piled higher, the laughter grew warmer, and Keisha stood in the middle of it all, unable to comprehend how her life could turn so suddenly, so completely. She whispered, almost to herself, "This doesn't feel real." The leader heard her. "It's real," he said, "and tomorrow, you'll see just how real." Her breath hitched. She looked at him, searching his face for meaning, but he didn't explain. He only smiled faintly, as though holding back a secret. And that was when she realized the knock at her door had been just the first step. The true weight of their brotherhood, their promise, was still to come. As the bikers worked and the neighbors whispered, Keisha felt the floor of her life shifting beneath her feet. She didn't know it yet, but the next sunrise would bring a revelation even greater than this. For now, she let herself breathe. For now, she let herself believe. The chapter closes with her standing in the center of her reborn apartment, tears drying on her cheeks, surrounded by strangers who had chosen to become brothers. And in the quiet hum of the moment, one truth echoed louder than the rest. This was only the beginning. It began with a single knock, then another. By the end of the week, it wasn't knocks that filled Keisha's block, it was the thunder of engines. The first time, neighbors pressed their faces against curtains, expecting trouble. But what they saw left them frozen. A dozen leather-clad bikers carried cans of paint, toolboxes, and rolls of insulation. Their boots echoed in the stairwell as they climbed to Keisha's apartment. And by sundown, the walls that once peeled with mold and dampness gleamed with a fresh coat of white. The second time, they brought heaters. The air in her apartment, once biting cold, now carried warmth that wrapped around her and her little brother like a long-lost hug. And by the third time, word had spread across the block. "Those bikers there fixing her place. You sure? I thought they were troublemakers." "No, I saw it with my own eyes. They patched her windows, carried in a couch." The whispers spread like wildfire. Each day, the rumble of bikes rolled in like a storm, but instead of chaos, they left behind light bulbs, furniture, laughter. A cracked floorboard was mended, a broken sink replaced, a mattress carried up 2 flights of stairs, hoisted by men who could have easily chosen not to care. Keisha's neighbors stood outside in disbelief, children tugging at their mothers' coats, pointing as men with skull patches and chains repainted a child's bedroom pink. Inside, Keisha's emotions swirled. Gratitude, disbelief, and fear that it might all vanish as quickly as it came. One evening, she turned to the leader, the same man who once took her last $8. "Why keep coming back?" she asked quietly. He set down his paintbrush, eyes steady on hers. "Because we don't pay back kindness once," he said, "we pay it forward. Until the debt is gone." Her voice cracked. "And when will that be?" A smile tugged at the edge of his scarred face. maybe never. That night, she sat on her new couch, her little brother curled against her side. The heater hummed softly, and for the first time in years, their apartment felt like a home. But outside, the rumors twisted. Some whispered fear, the Hell's Angels. In this neighborhood, something's bound to go wrong. Others whispered awe. Did you see them carry in a fridge? A fridge? Who does that? And some whispered envy. Why her? Why not us? Keisha felt the weight of every stare when she stepped outside. She heard the comments, saw the way people leaned into hushed conversations. But when she looked back at her apartment, glowing softly with repaired windows and warmth, she knew one thing: her life would never be the same. The bikers didn't just bring repairs, they brought presents. They stood watch at her building, leaning against their bikes at dusk. Mothers who once hurried their children inside now found themselves walking slower, realizing the streets felt safer with the rumble of engines nearby. Keisha's block was changing, and though she didn't know where it would lead, she couldn't deny the truth. The Brotherhood had returned, and they weren't leaving anytime soon. But what none of them could see, what even Keisha herself didn't know, was that their return was not just for her sake. Something deeper was stirring in the ranks of the Hell's Angels, and soon, the entire city would hear about it. Hope is a fragile thing. It flickers like a candle in the wind, always one gust away from being snuffed out. But for the first time in years, Keisha could feel that fragile flame burning brighter, not just for her, but for her little brother, Malik. At 12 years old, Malik had already seen too much. The streets had been his teacher, showing him things no child should ever learn so young. Keisha worried every night that he might slip into the same traps that had swallowed so many boys from their block. She carried that fear quietly, pretending strength, but deep inside she knew it was only a matter of time. Until the bikers noticed him. It started small. One afternoon, Malik lingered by the curb as the motorcycles lined up. He stared at the bikes with wide eyes, his curiosity too strong to hide. One of the older bikers, a towering man with gray streaks in his beard, crouched down beside him. "You like these machines, kid?" he asked, his voice rough but kind. Malik nodded eagerly. They're awesome." The man chuckled. "These aren't just machines. They're responsibility. You take care of a bike, it takes care of you. You respect it, it respects you. You mess around, it'll throw you to the pavement." Malik laughed nervously, but something in the biker's tone struck him. Responsibility, respect, words he hadn't heard often, at least not from men like this. From that day on, the bikers began including him. One brought him books, thick ones, with worn covers and folded pages. "Read these," he said. "Knowledge is horsepower for the brain." Another taught him discipline, how to stand tall, look a man in the eye, and speak with confidence. And when Malik tried to skip out on his homework, one of the bikers caught him. "You think toughness is about throwing fists?" He growled. "Nah, toughness is finishing what you start. Sit down, do the work." Keisha watched all of this unfold with disbelief. These men the world called dangerous were mentoring her brother, shaping him into someone she barely recognized. He began waking up earlier, keeping his room cleaner, even helping her without being asked. One evening, as Malik pored over a book the bikers had given him, Keisha sat beside him. "You like it?" she asked. He looked up, eyes shining. "Yeah, it makes me think. Maybe I could be more than what people expect me to be." Her throat tightened. "You can be anything, Malik, don't you ever forget that." But inside, she silently thanked the men who had planted that seed in him. The neighborhood noticed, too. Whispers followed Malik wherever he went. Some were jealous, some were cautious, but others said, "That boy's different now. Look at him, he's focused. He's got men watching out for him." It was true. The bikers weren't just fixing Keisha's apartment anymore. They were building something bigger, breaking a cycle that had gripped her family and her block for generations. One night, Keisha overheard a conversation between Malik and the Scarface biker, the same one she had given her last $8 to. Malik asked, "Why do you care?" "Why me?" The man was quiet for a moment, staring into the night. Then he said softly, "Because someone cared for me once, and it saved my life. Now it's my turn." Those words sank into Malik's heart like roots finding soil, and Keisha, listening in the shadows, felt tears sting her eyes. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream of a future, not one filled with survival and scarcity, but one with opportunity, growth, and freedom. Still, she couldn't shake the question, why her? Why Malik? Why had this brotherhood chosen them? Whatever the reason, she knew one thing. The cycle of struggle and hopelessness that had defined their lives was cracking open. The Hell's Angels weren't just changing her apartment, they were changing her brother. They were changing her, and as Keisha tucked Malik into bed that night, she whispered a silent prayer that this fragile flame of hope would keep burning, no matter what storms might come next. Because deep down, she knew, this was only the beginning. Darkness has a way of testing even the brightest hope, and for Keisha, just when her life finally began to feel safe, the shadows of her past came clawing back. It started with rumors that her ex-boyfriend, Darnell, had been seen drifting back into town. He was the kind of man who carried chaos like a second skin, a history of violence, a temper that didn't need a reason. For months, she had prayed he was gone for good. But deep down, Keisha knew men like him never disappeared. They circled back, drawn to weakness like wolves. One late night, the door rattled. Bang, 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 bang. A heavy fist slammed against the wood. Her little brother, Jamal, froze where he sat at the kitchen table, his wide eyes searching hers for reassurance. Keisha's stomach dropped. She didn't need to look. She already knew. Keisha, open up. His voice slurred, but the menace cut through the alcohol. You think you can hide from me? You think you can take what's mine? She pressed a finger to Jamal's lips, urging him to stay quiet. The pounding grew louder. Each thud felt like it echoed through her chest. I know you're in there, he growled, rattling the knob. You owe me, girl. Don't make me break this door down. Keisha's heart raced. The memories came flooding back, nights of shouting, bruises she covered with long sleeves, the shame she carried alone. She thought she had escaped that life. She thought it was over. But here it was, standing just feet away, threatening to shatter the fragile world she had built. And yet, Darnell wasn't alone. From the shadows across the street, engines rumbled quietly. Leather jackets glimmered under the faint glow of the Brotherhood had been watching, guarding, ever since the first day Keisha trusted them with her story. Tonight, their patience would be tested. Inside, Keisha grabbed her phone, trembling, but before she could dial, the door shuttered again. Last chance, Keisha, Darnell barked. Don't make me teach you a lesson. Her little brother whispered. What do we do? She swallowed hard. Stay behind me. The lock finally snapped, and the door swung open with a violent crack. Darnell stumbled inside, reeking of liquor, his eyes wild and red. He smirked when he saw her. There you are, he sneered, stepping closer. Thought you could run? Thought you could start a new life without me? He shoved a chair out of his way, his boots heavy on the floor. Where's my money, Keisha? I don't have anything for you, she said, her voice shaking but steady. You need to leave. He laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. Leave, girl, you don't tell me what to do. He lunged forward, grabbing her arm. Keisha winced but held her ground. Then, another sound. A low growl of vengeance. Doors creaking. Heavy boots on pavement. Darnell paused, his grip tightening as he turned toward the doorway. And there they were. The Hells Angels stepped out of the shadows, filling the entrance like a wall of iron. Jackets marked with flames and skulls. Eyes that burned with fury. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. One of them, Ryder, took a single step forward, his voice low and deliberate. Let her go. Darnell's bravado faltered for the first time. His drunken smirk twitched. What the hell is this? He spat. You think I'm scared of some bikers? The men didn't move, but the weight of their silence was suffocating. Jamal peeked from behind his sister, his small hands clenched in fists. Darnell barked a laugh, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. She's mine. She owes me. Ryder's eyes narrowed. She doesn't owe you a damn thing. Another biker stepped forward, his knuckles scarred from 100 fights. He cracked them slowly, like thunder rolling before a storm. Darnell's grip loosened just enough for Keisha to pull free. She stumbled back, clutching Jamal close. You don't belong here, Ryder said, his tone sharp as steel. This family is protected. You crossed that line again. He let the words hang, heavy, unfinished. Darnell sneered, but the color had drained from his face. He looked at the dozen men crowding the doorway, the shadows of more outside. For the first time, he realized he was outnumbered, outmatched. Fine, he muttered, stumbling backward. This ain't over, Keisha. You hear me? This ain't over. He staggered out into the night, his threats echoing into the empty street. But as he disappeared into the darkness, the bikers didn't chase him. They didn't need to. The message had been sent. Keisha collapsed into a chair, trembling as the adrenaline drained from her body. Jamal clung to her side. Ryder knelt beside her, his voice soft now, almost fatherly. He won't hurt you again, he said. Not while we're here. Tears welled in her eyes. For years, she had carried her fear alone. Now, for the first time, she wasn't alone anymore. Neighbors would talk about that night, about the roar of vengeance and the sight of leather-clad bikers guarding the small house of a young black girl. Some would whisper warnings, others would call it redemption. But for Keisha, it was more than protection. It was freedom. Because that night, when the past came knocking, she learned something powerful. Family doesn't always look the way you expect. Sometimes, it rides in on two wheels, ready to stand between you and the pain you thought would never end. And though Darnell had vanished into the darkness, Keisha knew one thing: this fight wasn't over. The storm had only begun to brew, but this time, she wouldn't face it alone. Sometimes justice doesn't walk into town wearing a badge. Sometimes, it roars down the street on two wheels. The night was still trembling from Darnell's intrusion when the sound came, an unearthly growl, deep and rising, like thunder that refused to fade. Keisha rushed to the doorway with Jamal clutching her hand, her breath catching in her throat. What she saw made her heart race. Engines, dozens of them. Headlights flared like fireflies in formation, the night air splitting with the sound of 100 motorcycles. They came from every direction, their chrome flashing beneath the lamps, tires crunching against the pavement. Darnell, still staggering from his drunken rage, froze at the sight. He had thought he'd slipped away, that his threats would leave Keisha trembling behind closed doors. But now, as the street filled with leather and steel, his smirk faded into fear. The roar grew louder, drowning out his curses. The bikers closed in, forming a perfect circle around him. A living wall of chrome and iron, 100 strong. Engines idling, lights blazing, every eye fixed on him. What is this? Darnell stammered, his swagger gone. He turned in frantic circles. Trapped. You think you can scare me? The leader, Ryder, cut his engine first. Slowly, one by one, the others followed, until the silence pressed heavier than the noise. Ryder swung his leg over his bike. Standing tall, the patches on his jacket catching the glow of the streetlights. His voice was calm, deliberate, but sharp enough to slice through Darnell's bravado. You came here drunk, violent, threatening a woman who owes you nothing. You thought no one was watching. He took a step closer. But we were. Ripple of voices rose behind him, low, steady, like a growl shared among wolves. Keisha gripped Jamal's hand tighter. From her porch, she watched with wide eyes, hardly able to believe what was happening. For the first time in years, she wasn't shrinking back in fear. She was standing tall, watching justice unfold. Darnell spat on the ground, desperate to mask his panic. She's mine. Always has been. The circle of bikers shifted, closing in tighter. Ryder's jaw clenched. No, he said firmly. She's her own, and she's under our protection. The crowd of neighbors began to gather now, drawn by the thunder of motorcycles and the sight of leather jackets under the Whispers spread quickly, whispers that soon grew into shouts. Leave her alone. A woman from across the street called. Yeah, get out of here. Another voice added. The tide was turning. Keisha could feel it. For so long, she had felt alone against Darnell's wrath. Now, the entire block stood as witnesses. Darnell's eyes darted from the bikers to the neighbors, his drunken courage draining with every second. He raised his fists, but his voice cracked when he shouted. You don't scare me. Another biker, scarred and broad-shouldered, revved his engine just once. The sound cracked like a whip in the night air. Darnell flinched. Ryder leaned in, his face inches from Darnell's. You should be scared, because this is where it ends. You don't put your hands on her again. You don't come near this street again. You walk away, or you'll learn what it means to answer to all of us. For the first time, Darnell's arrogance broke. His lips trembled. His fists dropped to his sides. He stumbled backward, muttering curses, trying to find a way through the circle. But the bikers didn't move. Not until Ryder gave a small nod. Then, slowly, a narrow path opened. The engines revved in unison, the sound deafening, vibrating through the pavement like a final warning. Darnell took his chance. Stumbling through the path, his head ducked, his shoulders trembling, he vanished into the dark, swallowed by the night. And then silence. The bikers cut their engines. The crowd of neighbors broke into applause, cheers rising like a wave. For once, fear wasn't the loudest voice on the block. Justice was. Keisha stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes. Her brother tugged her sleeve, whispering, They did it, Keisha. They made him leave. She nodded, unable to speak. The knot of fear that had lived in her chest for so long finally loosened. Ryder turned back to her, his expression softening. You're safe now, he said. He won't be back. And if he tries, he'll find all of us waiting. Keisha pressed her hand to her heart, overwhelmed. For the first time in her life, she believed it. She truly believed she was safe. The night ended not with screams, but with cheers. Not with fear, but with hope. And as Keisha stood on her porch, surrounded by neighbors who now saw her differently, and by bikers who had become her guardians, she knew this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about changing the story for her, for Jamal, and for everyone who had ever felt powerless. The engines had roared louder than her fear. And in that sound, she heard something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. But freedom, she would soon learn, is only the beginning of a new battle. Sometimes the hardest part of life isn't surviving the storm. It's daring to believe the sun will shine again. For the first time in years, Keisha woke without fear pressing down on her chest. No angry fists pounding on the door. No shadows creeping outside her window. No endless worry about whether her little brother would grow up knowing only struggle. Instead, she opened her eyes to the sound of Jamal's laughter drifting from the kitchen, where the scent of pancakes filled the air. She leaned against the doorframe, smiling softly. Jamal, once quiet and withdrawn, now hummed to himself as he set the table. His shoulders weren't slouched anymore. His eyes no longer carried that tired, hollow look. He was a child again, hopeful, curious, alive. And Keisha realized. So was she. The days that followed the night of vengeance and justice felt like stepping into an entirely new world. Neighbors who once pitied her now waved with warmth. Mothers who had kept their distance now offered to walk Jamal to school. And behind it all, in ways quiet and unseen, the brotherhood of bikers continued to weave protection around her life. One afternoon, Ryder knocked on her doorknob with engines rumbling behind him. But with an envelope in his hand, Keisha, he said, his tone unusually gentle. This is for you. She frowned, cautious. What is it? Opportunity. he answered simply. Then he placed the envelope in her hands and left without another word. Inside, she found tuition papers, a scholarship already paid, her name on it, a chance to finally attend the nursing classes she had once dreamed about but buried beneath years of survival. Tears blurred her vision as she sank into the couch. She whispered to herself, They did this for me. When she told Jamal later that night, his grin nearly split his face. You're gonna be a nurse, Keisha? Like you always wanted? Her chest tightened with pride. For the first time, her dreams weren't just fragile fantasies. They were within reach. The weeks that followed were filled with new rhythms. In the mornings, she walked to campus, books tucked under her arm, her head held higher than ever before. In the afternoons, Jamal rushed through the door with stories of school projects, new friends, and most shocking, of all good grades. The bikers didn't vanish either. They came in small ways, delivering groceries, fixing a leaky faucet, dropping off secondhand furniture for her tiny apartment. They never asked for thanks, but their actions carried a message. We've got you. One Saturday, Keisha sat on the porch, watching Jamal play basketball with two bikers who had stopped by. She laughed as Jamal tried to dribble around them, his small frame darting between their towering builds. You're teaching him more than just ball, she said. One of the men smirked. Kid's got heart. Just needs someone to show him how to use it. Keisha's laughter softened into silence as she watched. For so long, she had carried the weight of raising her brother alone. Now, she realized, they weren't alone anymore. But even as her heart swelled with gratitude, she wrestled with disbelief. Could this really last? Could one act of kindness, a single choice to give away her last $8, truly ripple outward this far? Late one night, lying awake in the quiet, she thought back to that evening at the diner. The way her hands had trembled as she handed over the crumpled bills. The fear of not knowing how she'd make it through the next day. And yet, that very moment had changed everything. Her lips curved into a smile. Maybe blessings come disguised as risks, she whispered to the dark. From that moment on, she refused to shrink back into fear. She leaned into the future with courage she hadn't known she possessed. The next semester, she aced her exams. Jamal brought home his first A on a math test, holding it up like a trophy. The neighbors, once whispering about the girl who had nothing, now spoke of the young woman who had turned her life around. Keisha's story was no longer one of survival. It was one of transformation. She stood in front of her mirror one morning, slipping into scrubs for the first time. She caught her reflection and whispered, We're not just surviving anymore, Jamal, we're living. Her brother looked up at her with a proud grin. Told you, Keisha, you're unstoppable. The sound of distant engines rumbled faintly in the background that morning, a reminder she would never again face the world alone. Her journey had begun with loss, struggle, and fear, but now Elliot was leading her toward something brighter. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness can spark a chain reaction that breaks cycles, heals wounds, and builds futures. And for Keisha and Jamal, this was only the beginning. Sometimes the loudest echoes come from the quietest acts. Keisha stood on the porch of her building, the morning sun spilling across cracked sidewalks and faded bricks. Around her, the block was unusually still. The roar that had once shaken windows and stirred whispers was now fading into the distance. The sound of 100 engines riding away together, the Hells Angels, leather jackets gleaming in the light, disappeared down the avenue like shadows swallowed by the horizon. For a long moment, she just watched. Jamal stood at her side, his small hand tucked into hers, eyes wide with wonder. The rumble softened, until silence returned. And yet, the silence was not the same as before. It wasn't empty. It wasn't frightening. It was peaceful. She exhaled slowly, a shaky breath that felt like she was finally letting go of years of fear, hunger, and doubt. They're gone, Jamal whispered. Keisha smiled faintly, squeezing his hand. No, baby, they're not gone. Not really, because deep down she knew their presence would remain long after the engines had vanished. Their kindness had left fingerprints on her life. Invisible but permanent. That night, as she sat by her window, Keisha reflected on how everything had begun. A single decision, 8 crumpled dollars, pressed into the hand of a stranger in need. At the time, it had felt like nothing more than a desperate Gambula sacrifice that left her stomach aching and her wallet empty. But in truth, it had been the seed of something much larger. She whispered into the quiet, almost as if confessing to herself, I thought I was giving everything I had. But really, I was opening a door. And once that door had opened, her world transformed. The bikers had brought groceries, furniture, protection. They had restored her apartment, mentored her brother, and reminded her of her own worth. But more than the tangible gifts, they had given her something priceless. Belief that she mattered, that kindness wasn't weakness, that even the smallest spark could light the darkest night. Jamal climbed into her lap, holding a book one of the bikers had given him. Read this one again, he said eagerly. She wrapped her arms around him and opened the cover. As her voice filled the room, her eyes drifted to the window. For the first time, the city lights outside no longer looked harsh. They glimmered like possibilities. And then the thought struck her, an ache, both tender and powerful. If one act of kindness could change our lives forever, What could happen if I kept giving? The question stirred in her chest, and she knew the answer would guide the rest of her days. Weeks later, as she walked to her nursing classes, she carried not just books, but the memory of those leather-clad riders who had shown her what family could look like. Each step she took forward felt like carrying their legacy, not just for herself, but for every stranger she might one day help. Her story had started with brokenness. It had wound through hunger, fear, and despair, but it had been rewritten by compassion, her own, and the Brotherhood's. And so, the echo of that kindness kept ringing, through Jamal's laughter, through the neighbors' whispers, through the quiet confidence in her own heartbeat. Sometimes miracles don't come crashing in with thunder. Sometimes they ride in on the back of an old motorcycle, wearing leather, carrying scars, and speaking the language of loyalty. And sometimes they begin with nothing more than $8 in the hand of a broke girl who dared to give. As Keisha closed her eyes that night, she knew this was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning of a new one built on a truth she would never forget. Even the smallest kindness can awaken the biggest miracles.